The sheriff leaned back in his worn leather chair, a cynical smirk playing on his lips as he looked at the reporter. "He's just an old farmer," he chuckled, waving a hand toward the outskirts of town. "There's nothing to see there, just dirt and ghosts." For 30 years, the town of Oakhaven bought that lie. They accepted the silence as part of the landscape. But silence is just a fragile seal, and in a climate-controlled room 1,000 miles away, a judge's gavel finally fell, cracking that seal wide open. When the clerk pulled the long-hidden file from the vault, it wasn't just dirt and ghosts that came spilling out, it was a history that would burn the sheriff's reputation to the ground. The town of Oakhaven was the kind of place where news traveled at the speed of a tractor. It was a place where people didn't ask questions if they wanted to keep their neighbors, and for 3 decades, Arthur Pendergast was the ultimate neighborhood ghost. He lived on the northern edge of the county, a sprawling, neglected tract of land that looked like it hadn't seen a productive harvest since the late 90s. He was a man of few words, a silhouette often seen at dusk walking his property line, his face perpetually hidden beneath the shadow of a grease-stained ball cap. To the locals, Arthur was a curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. To the law enforcement, however, Arthur was an inconvenience. Sheriff Miller, a man whose family had held the badge for 3 generations, viewed Arthur's existence as a stain on the county's tidy record. Every time a petty crime occurred, or a transient went missing, the sheriff's deputies would make a perfunctory visit to the farm. They would kick at the dirt, smoke a cigarette while leaning against their cruiser, and walk away with the same report: "Nothing to see here." But the "nothing to see" defense began to wear thin. There was a subtle tension in the way the sheriff spoke about Arthur. It wasn't the casual dismissal one shows toward a harmless drifter. There was a visceral edge to it, a practiced layer of contempt that served as a gatekeeper for anyone getting too close to the property line. The contrast between Arthur's quiet, stagnant life and the sheriff's palpable anxiety was the first thread that began to unravel the narrative. Why was the most powerful man in town so obsessed with keeping eyes off a failed farmer? The answer lay in the geography of the town itself. Oakhaven wasn't just a quiet farming community, it was a nexus of shifting land rights and industrial development. The property Arthur held sat on a subterranean anomaly, a geological quirk that major energy conglomerates had been eyeing for years. The sheriff, through a complex web of shell companies and local development boards, had been the unofficial shepherd of these land acquisitions. Arthur, however, had never signed a single deed. He had sat on that land, surrounded by crumbling barns and rusting equipment, effectively acting as an immovable object in a town where the sheriff was the unstoppable force. The conflict wasn't about farming, it was about leverage. Arthur had become the unintentional guardian of a secret that the sheriff had spent decades trying to bury. The locals didn't know that Arthur had once been a man of immense influence, a corporate strategist who understood the language of contracts and litigation better than anyone in the county. He wasn't a farmer hiding from the world, he was a master playing a long, patient game of chess against a man who thought he was only playing checkers. The sheriff's mistake was thinking that because he controlled the local narrative, he controlled reality. He relied on the assumption that everyone was as short-sighted as the deputies he commanded. He underestimated the reach of the legal system once a case crossed a certain threshold of complexity. In a world where information is the most dangerous currency, Arthur held the ledger. And while the sheriff was busy building a legacy on top of a foundation of lies, Arthur was methodically preparing to pull the rug out. The turning point didn't come from a dramatic shootout or a sudden discovery of a crime scene. It came from the mundane, gray world of administrative law. A high-profile legal firm, representing a client completely unrelated to Oakhaven, had been scouring regional court records for a specific, unrelated land use case. They were looking for a precedent, a needle in a haystack of municipal filings. What they found instead was a sealed file, buried deep within a secondary archive that hadn't been touched in 25 years. It was misfiled under a minor civil dispute, but the presence of the seal, the specific type of court-ordered silence, flagged the firm's investigators. They weren't looking for a story, but they couldn't ignore a ghost. They started pulling threads. They traced the history of the land, the shell companies involved, and the curious pattern of judicial appointments that occurred right around the time the file was sealed. They realized that this wasn't just a land dispute, it was a cover-up for a series of illegal acquisitions that involved local authorities. They filed a motion to unseal the records, citing the public interest in potential malfeasance. The motion sat on a judge's desk for 3 months, a silent battleground of legal briefs and midnight phone calls. When the judge finally granted the motion, the seal didn't just break, it shattered. The information contained in that file was a roadmap to a systematic dismantling of the sheriff's power. It contained names, dates, financial transfers, and a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight back to the sheriff's own office. But more importantly, it revealed the true identity of the man living on the northern edge of the property line. Arthur Pendergast was gone the moment the file was opened. He didn't wait for the sheriff to realize his secret was out. He had anticipated the moment the legal firm would make their move. He left behind a property that was no longer just dirt and ghosts, but a crime scene. The sheriff, unaware of the impending collapse, walked into his office that morning expecting another day of local politics, completely oblivious to the fact that his legacy was currently being unsealed in a courtroom 300 miles away. The courtroom was deceptively quiet when the motion was finally granted. It was a sterile, climate-controlled space, a far cry from the dusty, sun-baked fields of Oakhaven. The judge, an elderly man with thick spectacles who had seen his share of small-town corruption, didn't offer a dramatic speech. He simply signed the order, his pen scratching against the paper with a finality that echoed louder than a gunshot. In the back row, a junior associate from the firm, who had initially only been looking for a mundane precedent on property zoning, sat motionless. He knew exactly what he was holding, the skeleton key to the entire county. As the physical file was pulled from the archive, a process that involved layers of dust and forgotten bureaucratic protocols, the reality of what they had uncovered began to sink in. This wasn't a simple land acquisition case. It was a blueprint for a quiet, long-term theft of regional resources. The file detailed how the sheriff, leveraging his position as the ultimate authority in a remote jurisdiction, had orchestrated a series of adverse possession claims against landowners who couldn't afford to fight him. He would identify vulnerable properties, tie them up in endless, expensive litigation until the owner surrendered, and then sweep in with his shell companies to purchase them for cents on the dollar. But the file contained something even more disturbing, the Pendergast exception. Arthur wasn't just a random target, he had been the sheriff's primary obstacle for years. The documents revealed that the sheriff had attempted, on at least 3 separate occasions, to force Arthur off his land using trumped-up safety violations, health code citations, and even a targeted investigation into Arthur's past that had gone nowhere. Yet, Arthur had remained. The file showed that Arthur had been filing countermotions that were so technically proficient, so perfectly argued, that they had terrified the sheriff's legal team. They had essentially hit a wall of intellectual superiority that they couldn't overcome with local muscle, forcing them to resort to the ultimate coward's move, the sealed court file. The sheriff had managed to bury the entire conflict by bribing a lower-level administrative judge to seal the case under the guise of sensitive security information. It was a brilliant, albeit illegal, maneuver. It turned the legal system against itself, weaponizing secrecy to protect a crime. As the associate flipped through the pages, the contrast between the sheriff's public persona, the salt-of-the-earth lawman, and the reality contained in the documents was staggering. He was a predator in a uniform, a man who had built his reputation on the very people he was systemically ruining. Back in Oakhaven, the sheriff was still operating under the delusion of total control. He was hosting the annual county fair, shaking hands, and smiling for the local paper. He stood on the podium, his chest puffed out, talking about protecting the community and keeping the peace. Little did he know that 300 miles away, the digital copies of that file were being uploaded to a secure server. They weren't being leaked to the local press, he had them in his pocket, but to a national investigative bureau that specialized in systemic corruption. The strategy was calculated. They knew if they dropped the file in Oakhaven, the sheriff's cronies would kill the story before it hit the front page. They needed to bypass the local echo chamber entirely. They needed to bring in an outside force that the sheriff couldn't intimidate or dismiss. The bold farmer had been right all along, patience was the only weapon that mattered. By staying on his land, by refusing to move, he had forced the sheriff to reveal his hand over and over again, leaving a paper trail so long and so damning that it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the pattern. The transition from the quiet of the courtroom to the impending firestorm in Oakhaven was subtle at first. It started with a series of phone calls. The sheriff's office began receiving inquiries from federal agents, people who didn't care about local politics, people who didn't know the sheriff's father or his grandfather. These were investigators with cold, professional voices who didn't want to talk about the county fair, they wanted to talk about shell companies in Delaware and land transfers in the state archives. The sheriff's confidence began to fracture. He tried to brush off the first call, telling the agent that there must be some mistake, that he was being targeted by disgruntled litigants. But the second call came, and then a third. Each time, the questioning became more specific. They were asking about dates he had long since purged from his own memory. He started to realize that the "nothing to see here" defense wasn't going to work against people who were looking at aerial drone footage of his own property acquisitions. He grew increasingly paranoid. He started spending more time in his office, his door locked, pacing the floor. He knew someone had leaked something, but he couldn't imagine who. He had effectively neutralized everyone who had ever stood in his way, or so he thought. He still didn't suspect the old man in the farmhouse. To him, Arthur was still just a broken-down farmer, a man with no resources, no connections, and certainly no ability to orchestrate a federal investigation. That blindness, that total inability to see his victim as a credible threat, was the sheriff's fatal flaw. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the town became palpable. The sheriff's deputies noticed the change in their boss. He was shorter-tempered, more prone to outbursts, and he had become obsessed with monitoring the roads leading out of town. He was preparing for an invasion that was already happening from within the legal system. He didn't see the danger in the documents, he only saw the danger to his status. And that was the difference between a man fighting for his survival and a man fighting to keep his secrets. The federal investigators weren't just looking for isolated acts of greed, they were mapping a network. What they found in the unsealed file was a meticulously documented ledger of municipal rot. Every time the sheriff had seized a piece of land, he had used a specific, proprietary process involving a network of shell companies registered in states with opaque privacy laws. These companies were technically owned by trusts, and those trusts were managed by firms that had never once conducted business in Oakhaven. It was a classic, daisy chain structure designed to frustrate anyone who attempted to track the final beneficiary. But the unsealed file contained the internal ledger, the handwritten notes of the sheriff's former attorney, who had kept a record of every move to protect himself in the event of an audit. The sheriff had clearly underestimated the value of keeping his subordinates in the loop. By excluding his own counsel from the full scope of his activities, he had left behind a paper trail that served as a roadmap to his downfall. The investigators followed the money from the Oakhaven land sales back into accounts that directly serviced the sheriff's personal lifestyle. They found records of offshore real estate purchases, luxury vehicle registrations, and even tuition payments for his children, all funneled through accounts that were theoretically meant for municipal development. As the investigators pieced together the timeline, the narrative of the old farmer became the central focus of the entire investigation. Arthur Pendergast wasn't just a victim, he was the one who had kept the lights on in the dark. It turned out that Arthur had been systematically collecting evidence for over 2 decades. He had been recording conversations, logging the arrival and departure times of every deputy that visited his property, and, most crucially, he had been filing placeholder motions with the state court. These motions weren't designed to be won immediately, they were designed to force the sheriff's office to file formal responses. Every time the sheriff filed a response to avoid a conflict, he created an official document that Arthur would then copy and store in a secure, off-site location. It was a brilliant, passive-aggressive form of warfare. Arthur had turned the bureaucracy into his own personal surveillance team. He had effectively forced the sheriff to document his own crimes under oath. When the investigators finally sat down to review the massive cache of documents Arthur had left behind when he abandoned his property, they were stunned. It wasn't the work of a desperate farmer, it was the work of a highly trained legal strategist. The contrast between the sheriff's chaotic, emotional reactions and Arthur's cold, calculated documentation was absolute. The sheriff had been playing a game of intimidation, relying on his badge and his reputation to silence opposition. Arthur, however, had been playing a game of record-keeping, knowing that in the long run, the truth is not something you protect, it is something you archive. The paper trail revealed that the sheriff had even gone so far as to plant evidence. Arthur's property on two separate occasions, only for Arthur to capture the entire event on hidden cameras and then quietly submit the footage to a third-party solicitor, not to sue, but to have the event notarized for future use. The sheer patience involved was staggering. Most people would have snapped under the pressure of 20 years of harassment. They would have either given up and moved, or they would have lashed out and given the sheriff exactly the excuse he needed to put them away. Arthur had done neither. He had simply endured, absorbing every blow and turning it into a data point. This was the Pendergast exception, the realization that the sheriff had been dealing with a man who was playing a game on a completely different level of complexity. Back in Oakhaven, the investigation was no longer a secret. Word had begun to trickle down through the town's grapevine. People who had long suspected the sheriff of being corrupt but had been too afraid to speak up started to find their voices. They saw that the law was finally catching up to the man who had long considered himself above it. Witnesses who had been intimidated into silence for years started coming forward, sharing their own stories of land seizures, threats, and forced settlements. The power structure that had once seemed immovable was now showing visible cracks. The sheriff, meanwhile, was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown. His world was shrinking by the hour. Every phone call, every unexpected knock at his office door, and every strange vehicle that passed by his home added to his mounting dread. He couldn't go back to the way things were, but he also couldn't move forward without exposing his own crimes. He was trapped in the very net he had spent his career weaving for others. He tried to reach out to his political allies, hoping that someone would help him squash the investigation. But he found that they were all distancing themselves. In politics, corruption is accepted as long as it remains invisible. The moment it becomes a public liability, it is discarded. The sheriff had become a liability. His name was now synonymous with a scandal that was gaining national attention. The local paper, which had for years published his press releases without question, was now running front-page stories on the federal investigation. He was being treated as an outcast in his own town. The transition from the untouchable, old farmer, tormentor to the disgraced public official was swift and brutal. It was a masterclass in how quickly an artificial reputation can disintegrate when the underlying reality is finally exposed. As the federal net tightened, the sheriff's focus shifted from protecting his reputation to saving his own skin. He started destroying records, deleting digital files, and attempting to fabricate alibis, but he was once again too late. The investigators already had everything they needed. The paper trail was already complete, and it pointed directly to him. The tragedy, if one could call it that, was that he never realized that his biggest threat wasn't the federal government or the media. It was the quiet man in the farmhouse who had simply refused to play the game according to the sheriff's rules. Arthur had won not by fighting, but by outlasting. The mystery of Arthur Pendergast's identity was the final piece of the puzzle that the investigators had to solve. Who was this man, really? How did a retired, seemingly average individual possess the tactical acumen to outmaneuver a corrupt sheriff for 2 decades? The deeper they dug, the more the bold farmer persona dissolved, revealing a man of significant professional stature. It turned out that Arthur Pendergast had once been a high-level corporate strategist for one of the largest logistics firms in the country. He had spent his career dissecting complex legal frameworks, managing large-scale infrastructure disputes, and navigating the Byzantine world of international property law. He hadn't been hiding in Oakhaven because he was a failure. He had moved there specifically to escape the grind of the corporate machine, seeking a quiet existence that he had earned. When he found himself in the crosshairs of the sheriff, he didn't panic. He saw the situation for what it was, another corporate acquisition attempt, albeit one run by a small-town thug rather than a boardroom of executives. His background allowed him to view the sheriff's actions through a lens of professional detachment. He treated the sheriff's harassment like a business process that needed to be mitigated, documented, and eventually shut down. The investigators were floored. The farmer was a retired architect of the very types of systems that the sheriff was trying to poorly replicate. Arthur's decision to stay on his land wasn't just a stubborn refusal to leave, it was an exercise in strategic resistance. He had known, from the very beginning, that the sheriff's methods were unsustainable. He had watched the local power dynamics unfold with the calm confidence of a man who knows exactly how the game ends. He had essentially been conducting a real-world stress test on the sheriff's corruption, feeding the sheriff just enough rope to hang himself. The contrast between the two men was now undeniable. The sheriff relied on primitive, blunt force tactics, threats, intimidation, and raw, unchecked authority. Arthur, in turn, employed high-level, sophisticated legal maneuvers, maintaining a standard of proof that was bulletproof. The sheriff was playing a game of local influence, while Arthur was playing a game of federal compliance and administrative record-keeping. The sheriff's fatal mistake was assuming that because he held the badge, he held all the power. He didn't understand that true power in the modern age lies in the ability to command the truth through evidence, not just the ability to exert force. As the investigators uncovered more about Arthur's past, they also began to understand the why. It wasn't just about the land. Arthur had a history of advocacy. He had spent his later years quietly providing pro bono consulting to families who had been displaced by similar municipal land grabs across the country. He had seen the pattern of systemic abuse repeating itself in various jurisdictions, and he had made it his personal mission to stand in the way. He had chosen Oakhaven because it was the epicenter of a particularly egregious example of this abuse, and he had chosen to plant his flag firmly in the soil. The hidden history also revealed that Arthur had not been acting alone, at least not in the sense that he had built a network of support from other victims across the county. Through encrypted channels and quiet, offline communication, he had been mentoring these families, teaching them how to document their own grievances and how to use the legal system to protect their rights. He was the silent architect of a grassroots rebellion that the sheriff had been too busy and too arrogant to notice. While the sheriff was focused on the old farmer, on the edge of town, he was completely oblivious to the fact that his own house was being dismantled from the inside. This revelation changed the nature of the case. It was no longer just about one man's land dispute, it was about a larger, systemic pattern of corruption that had spanned years and affected dozens of families. The federal investigators realized that they were sitting on a gold mine of actionable information that could lead to a massive, multi-jurisdictional prosecution. The sheriff wasn't just going to lose his job, he was going to face a lifetime of legal repercussions. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The man the sheriff had dismissed as a nuisance, a ghost, and just an old farmer, was the one who had finally turned the light on. He had been the one to document the abuse, build the case, and wait for the perfect moment to execute his plan. He had played the long game, enduring years of hardship and isolation to ensure that the truth would eventually surface in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. The transition from the mystery of the sealed court file to the reality of the sheriff's crimes was now complete. The investigation had moved from a singular, isolated event into a full-scale dismantling of a local corrupt regime. The files, the testimony, and the evidence were now all lined up, ready to be presented in a court of law that the sheriff couldn't influence. The stage was set for the final act, the moment when the sheriff would finally have to face the man he had underestimated, but this time, the playing field wouldn't be his office or his town. It would be a federal courtroom, where the rules were set, the judge was neutral, and the old farmer had all the records. The final act of this drama did not take place in the rolling, dusty fields of Oakhaven, but in the sterile, high-ceilinged austerity of a federal courthouse. When the sheriff finally walked through the double doors, he didn't look like the man who had smirked at reporters just a few months prior. The swagger was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out stare of a man who had realized, far too late, that the world he once dominated was never his to control. He sat at the defendant's table, flanked by high-priced attorneys who looked at him with the same professional distance one might show to a sinking ship. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative destruction. They didn't lead with bombast, they led with the record. They projected the documents, the emails, and the timestamps onto large screens. They showed the jury the exact moment the sheriff had decided that his badge was a license to steal. And then, they introduced the most powerful exhibit of all, the comprehensive, meticulously organized archive provided by Arthur Pendergast. As the judge reviewed the evidence, it became clear that this was not a trial about a single piece of land. It was a forensic autopsy of a moral failure. Every witness testimony, every bank statement, and every recorded conversation served as a nail in the coffin of the sheriff's career. The irony was suffocating. The man who had once sneered at just an old farmer was now being systematically unmade by that very same man's dedication to the truth. The courtroom was silent when Arthur Pendergast was called to the stand. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like exactly what he had always been, a man of quiet determination who valued the truth above comfort. As he recounted the 2 decades of harassment, his tone was not one of anger, but of cold, hard observation. He detailed the sheriff's tactics with the precision of a surgeon. He explained the legal traps he had set, the way he had forced the sheriff to sign his own indictment, and the patience required to watch a predator believe he was winning until the very second the trap snapped shut. The sheriff couldn't look him in the eye. He stared at his hands, those hands that had signed land deeds, authorized intimidation, and held a badge he never deserved. The contrast framing was finally complete. The sheriff's chaotic, emotional, and petty greed stood in stark, irreconcilable contrast to Arthur's calm, patient, and principled pursuit of justice. It was the victory of the strategist over the bully, the triumph of the archive over the secret. When the verdict was read, a decisive guilty on all counts, the town of Oakhaven didn't erupt in immediate celebration. Instead, there was a collective, heavy sigh of relief. The cloud of fear that had hovered over the community for a generation had finally dissipated. The land, the farms, and the records that had been locked away in sealed files were now being returned to the public domain. The old farmer had done more than just win a case, he had restored the rule of law to a place that had forgotten it. Arthur Pendergast didn't stay to soak in the praise or the media frenzy. He didn't seek the spotlight. Once the sentencing was finalized and the legal proceedings were fully concluded, he simply packed a small bag and returned to his life. He had fulfilled his mission. He had shown that no matter how deep the seal on a court file, no matter how powerful the person holding the gavel, the truth eventually forces its way into the light. The sheriff was led away, a relic of a time when secrets were protected by silence and authority was built on sand. He would spend the remainder of his years in a place where he no longer had the power to make the rules. His legacy, once touted as a bastion of protection, was reduced to a cautionary tale in a federal textbook on corruption. In the end, Oakhaven changed. It became a place where people asked questions again. The farmers looked at their deeds, the town council began opening their meetings to the public, and the shadow that had once stretched across the northern edge of the county vanished. The old farmer had become a local legend, not as a ghost, but as a sentinel. He had proven that silence is not the same as ignorance, and that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding all the cards. The sealed file had been opened, the light had been shown, and for the first time in 30 years, the town of Oakhaven was finally, truly free of the man who had tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of dust and lies. The story serves as a final reminder. The old farmer had done more than just win a case, he had restored the rule of law to a place that had forgotten it. Arthur Pendergast didn't stay to soak in the praise or the media frenzy. He didn't seek the spotlight. Once the sentencing was finalized and the legal proceedings were fully concluded, he simply packed a small bag and returned to his life. He had fulfilled his mission. He had shown that no matter how deep the seal on a court file, no matter how powerful the person holding the gavel, the truth eventually forces its way into the light. The sheriff was led away, a relic of a time when secrets were protected by silence and authority was built on sand. He would spend the remainder of his years in a place where he no longer had the power to make the rules. His legacy, once touted as a bastion of protection, was reduced to a cautionary tale in a federal textbook on corruption. In the end, Oakhaven changed. It became a place where people asked questions again. The farmers looked at their deeds, the town council began opening their meetings to the public, and the shadow that had once stretched across the northern edge of the county vanished. The old farmer had become a local legend, not as a ghost, but as a sentinel. He had proven that silence is not the same as ignorance, and that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding all the cards. The sealed file had been opened, the light had been shown, and for the first time in 30 years, the town of Oakhaven was finally, truly free of the man who had tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of dust and lies. The story serves as a final reminder. Never underestimate the man who stands his ground while the world tries to move him. The truth is inevitable, it is just a matter of who is patient enough to wait for it to arrive.